Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Uri Dromi, and I run the Jerusalem Press Club. This is a good opportunity to thank our staff, Maya Kowalmansky over there, and Rachel Ziel over there. She's a new addition to our staff, so welcome. Over there. Please turn off your cell phone or switch them to silent modes. I want to congratulate Walter here, because not only is written in the Guinness Book of Records of being the oldest living radio journalist, active one, but I just heard that at the age of 95, he did Tznicha Chofshit, I call it free fall, right? Skydiving. So, congratulations. What's next? What's next?
I'm thinking about my next trip. There will be one.
Please keep us informed. זה חם מדי דרך אגב, and I'm very pleased to host this afternoon Dr. Eran Lerman, Colonel. He was the Deputy Director of Foreign Policy and International Affairs at the National Security Council, the Israeli Prime Minister's Office. Held important senior roles in the military intelligence for 20 years. Also served 8 years as the director of the Israel Middle East Office of the American Jewish Committee. Teaches about the Middle East, Shalem, Tel Aviv University, Command Staff College, and published a few interesting publications about this. He'll talk about Gaza today. I suggest a 20-minute talk, and then we'll open for Q&A. Please.
I think I should also mention that I'm now Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute, still called Strategic Studies, but the name will change slightly in the next few weeks, but we'll still be there. We just had an interesting conference yesterday on Iran, where Defense Minister Lerman actually expressed also his opinions about Gaza. What I'm going to suggest is slightly different from his take. It's not radically in the opposite direction, but I would start by saying I've just written a piece for the JSS that will be published soon, which I call In Praise of Conflict Management. There are situations in life, I think this is one of them, where the urge to solve once and for all a problem may be misguided. It's a familiar urge. It's rooted in our own Jewish traditions. It's rooted in Western tradition. It is prominent in American philosophical pragmatism. It very often leads to very constructive things being done to solve problems, and sometimes it leads you down an extremely complicated operational design that ends up doing more harm than good because there's some basic flaw in it.
This you call a slight deviation from what Lieberman said.
I believe that military action is not, should definitely not be ruled out. I think he's very right to make it very clear to Hamas that we are very close to the edge or the end of our patience. And I think he's speaking to them as much as he's speaking to the gallery. And I think that this is a necessary complement to the current efforts that the Egyptians are making. But it is my belief that there's logic in the position of the Israeli defense establishment, which says, right now, an aggressive, sometimes brutal, conflict management by the way, true also for the Palestinian situation in the West Bank. Rather than an attempt to solve this problem once and for all, is probably the more rational choice. Let's start by looking at the basic dynamics of the situation in Gaza. Hamas has now been in power, having taken power in a brutal, murderous coup in 2007. All I can say is that had they not done so, they probably would have been the subject of an equally brutal act of suppression by Dahlan, which reminds me of a story that Churchill once used in his memoirs about a guy who wanted to administer some medication to the bear by blowing some medicine powder down his mouth, but the bear blew first. And in this case, Hamas blew first, and Dahlan ended up losing his base. This was done with extreme brutality, as we all know. And since then, they have held power in Gaza and consolidated their power in Gaza for more than 11 years now. And despite the fantasies about a reconciliation act that somehow would end up by Hamas submitting to actual governance from Ramallah, the likelihood of this really happening, beyond some cosmetic changes in the makeup of certain ministries in Gaza, the core question of control over military forces in Gaza will not be resolved through this reconciliation. They will simply not accept being governed by Majid Faraj and his men from Ramallah, by the Palestinian security establishment. The depths of mutual hatred, suspicion, unsettled accounts is such that I do not see any political scenario, diplomatic scenario, under which Hamas will end up submitting to Ramallah's will until change of a much more cardinal nature takes place to bring an end to Hamas rule in Gaza. So we need to look reality straight in the face. The de facto government in Gaza, illegitimate as it is. And interestingly, still, after 11 years, still unrecognized by the international community. And I have to say, this is remarkable. We did not expect the quartet position to be upheld for that long. And in fact, 1/4 of the quartet, the Russians, basically do recognize Hamas in some way. But the quartet, as an institution, laid down 3 rules. These are not Israeli rules. These are the quartet rules. Hamas must renounce terrorism, accept Israel's right to exist, and accept the existing agreements. None of this has happened, and Hamas remains an illegitimate government. But it is a de facto government. And we need to be very sober about the prospects of having them overthrown by anything short of a major military intervention at this point in time. Or down the road, the Egyptians are dreaming about bringing about in Gaza something similar to what the present government of Egypt, the present leadership of Egypt, the soldiers, Sisi and his men, with Saudi and UAE support, brought about in July 13, or actually June 13, massive popular demonstrations against the Brotherhood rule, against Morsi as president, followed by a military intervention on the 3rd of July 13. As a vision, fine. As a design for action in the immediate and intermediate future, I don't see a tamarrud equivalent emerging in Gaza. So the question is, should we go in and bring an end to this by Israeli military force? And there are advocates of this. And by the way, when we talk about a massive military strike, we walk to the edge of that option, because if that strike is followed by a persistent barrage of rockets, then we, on Israeli urban centers, then the urge to follow up by a massive military incursion will also will bring us to the same outcome as a decision for conquest outright. So we are walking or may very well. It's a risk we would be running. It's a very real risk we would be running if we do that. So the IDF is not acting out of, I've seen the words and I've seen the terms, and they seem to be totally absurd. They're not acting out of cowardice or the lack of commitment to the national interest, or a simple-minded fixation upon the existing situation. They are acting out of a pretty rational calculation as to what could be the consequences of a major military act to basically break Hamas. And then, by the way, and then what? It's not a question of the losses in the operation itself. Politically, I believe that the great majority of Israelis would support such an operation that ends up with the restoration of military control in Gaza for a certain period of time. But what happens the day after, when the losses begin to mount in daily operations? Not to mention that we would be the ones who would now be delivering social services, electricity and water free of charge, that's to say at our expense, to 2 million people. Beyond that, and I do not believe that the international community or Abu Mazen, at his ripe old age, would actually volunteer to come riding on an Israeli tank into Gaza to take control. Neither does the Israeli defense establishment. So we would end up being saddled with the duties of running Gaza once again. And I think, unpleasantly, but with some degree of certainty, predict that this would involve the cost of an assassination here, a murder there, a terror attack on our soldiers, terror attack on those Israelis who would be coming in to provide social services and economic supplies. The cost would mount steadily until we come back to the kind of public reaction that we had over Lebanon back in the late 90s. And if we end up then being run out of Gaza by this kind of situation, I think we've lost more than we gained. So we are back in our minds to what has always been of the three basic principles of Ben Gurion's concept of Israel's national defense. You know the Hebrew, harta'ah, hatra'ah, hachra'ah. By the way, Ben Gurion never wrote this. It's not in the text of his famous speech in '53. It's all been deduced from his thought later on into a typical Israeli thing. You know, in the IDF, everything goes in 3 parts except the chicken, which goes in 16. And this is also, they build up an elegant scheme of 3 elements: deterrence, early warning, and decisive victory. There's no exact translation of hachra'ah. Bringing the enemy to his knees, that's literally. The top priority has always been deterrence. And the dynamics of deterrence, this is what I really want to focus on, are more complex than most people realize. It's not just a question of how much firepower we can bring to bear. and how much firepower do they have? Because on that question, I think there is a degree of clarity even in the mind of Yahya Sinwar. Actually, probably greater clarity than there was before he took over, the commander of the military forces in Gaza, the Hamas military forces. He knows what we are capable of, and he knows what they are capable and no longer capable of. By the way, in the process, over the last few years, due to Israeli technological breakthroughs, they've lost two of their most effective weapons. The ability to rain rockets on Israel has been seriously curtailed by Iron Dome and now the mid-layer, David Sling. And the tunnel system is being systemically destroyed through certain technological breakthroughs in the detection of cavities in alluvial soil. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but this is how it works. So as a result, they're even weaker now vis-a-vis Israel than they would have been a year ago, 2 years ago, in case of conflict. So the deterrence is not a question simply of who's stronger. It also includes the question of what will be the, well, direct certainly, but also indirect costs for a country like Israel that lives in the international environment, that is an export-based, fiercely competitive export-based economy that needs access to markets, that for whom international legitimacy is a central question. How would our use of force affect our position both internally and internationally? In other words, it is legitimate to use force when you have been left with no choice. But if you make your own determination to go and use violence, there needs to be a very good case for it. And interestingly, Hamas have been walking the very thin line of doing the kind of things that would not bring us over that edge. The kite campaign or the border breaches campaign. I don't find the term protesters relevant. Everyone talks about protesters. They're not protesters. They are assailants who are trying to breach the fence and obliterate what they see as the distinction between their part of Palestine and the rest of Palestine, which they are committed to liberate. But they have chosen the modes of action, kinds of action, carefully chosen so as not to push us over the edge, as in 2014 or 2012 or 2009.
Even with the Samar interview in which he suddenly said something.
Which is interesting because 2 weeks before he was bragging about raining rockets on Israel for 6 months. Somebody must have told him that he sounds like an Arab idiot from the 1960s before they've learned a lesson. So he switched completely into being all of a sudden being acutely aware that war is a bad idea, which is impressive in itself. The switch is interesting. So legitimacy is part of the equation. Our military capabilities are certainly part of the equation, but there is also a third part of the equation. And that has to do with Israel's place in a very incoherent, problematic entity called, which I nevertheless would still call the camp of stability in the region. I would say the Arab world, because the other two major non-Arab players in the region, there's Israel, Turkey, Iran, and the Arabs. Iran is a destabilizer. Turkey is a destabilizer, at least under Erdogan. Whereas Israel finds herself today in the same, well, I think, driving on the same road, driving the same direction as others in the Arab world who want to stem the tide of revolutionary change, to control the kind of upheaval that nearly swept much of the region earlier in this decade, and see these events essentially as a bid by various types of Islamist totalitarian revolutionaries. Again, I'm very careful to avoid the term Islam. It's not Islam which is the enemy. Sisi is as good a Muslim as any, but he is committed to countering this disease of his own civilization, of his own religion, which I would call Islamist totalitarianism, Islamawiyah. Iran is, of course, one proponent of that. Daesh, mistakenly translated as ISIS, is the other. It should be, if at all, ISIL, because Sham is the Levant, it's not just Syria. And in any case, they have spread beyond Iraq and Syria. So just let's call them IS, Islamic State. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, that's not his name, that's the name he took, and his caliphate. And the third element are the Muslim Brotherhood, backed by Qatar, backed by Turkey, and in control of Gaza. Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood offshoot. Which means that we don't need to explain to the Egyptians that there's a problem. I think they hate Hamas with greater venom than we do. Because for us, Hamas is a painful irritant, incapable of having an effect on the Israeli body politic. It can give us terrible pain. It can murder our citizens. It can kill our children. Almost did, by mistake. Apparently. I mean, I accept. I don't know if it was a lightning or a rogue element, but I don't think this was ordered. This may have been Hamas rockets. It was not under orders from Hamas, the Hamas leadership. It doesn't fit anything else, and they were very quick to disavow any involvement in this. But there's no question they are a nasty element, but they do not have traction in Israel. They barely have traction in the Palestinian Authority areas. In Egypt, where probably 15% of the population remains silently loyal to the vision of the Muslim Brotherhood, despite the immense repression of the last 5 years, Hamas being a Brotherhood emirate on Egypt's border, for the Egyptian regime, this is a threat. So we don't have to explain anything to the Egyptians in terms of why Hamas are bad guys. But we did manage to have I think, and I believe this has been a complex and at times complicated discussion, but the Egyptians have come to the same conclusion as we did, which is, this is we, and so I'm talking about the Israeli defense establishment, leaving the political arguments aside, that to take an organization like Hamas, contain it, frustrate it, force it to the point in which they are willing to trade away for a number of years, not for perpetuity, their commitment as a jihadi organization to kill the Jews in return for minor economic benefits. That's actually a good thing, because that leads to the attrition of the entire ideological position of Hamas, leaves them in the grip of Israeli and Egyptian leverages, and is probably preferable to anything that we can achieve through massive military action. Some people in Israel fantasize about an Egyptian military intervention. I don't think it's in our interest. To subdue Gaza, the Egyptians would need to put 2 to 3 divisions there, and I don't want 2 or 3 Egyptian divisions within a short drive from Ashkelon. So paradoxically, despite the hate between Hamas and Egypt, Hamas was forced to look at the Egyptians as their sole conduit. through which to talk about their future. By the way, and here I can speak from direct experience from within. Now I'm an observer, an advisor, like the famous cat in the joke. But when I was in government in 2014, during the 7 weeks of conflict, this is poorly understood in Israel. Why did we go on for 7 weeks when we could have terminated this with the help of Turkey and Qatar after 2 weeks? And the answer is, it was very clear to us that it would be wrong to give the Turks, to give Erdogan and Al Thani, the ruling house of Qatar, this pleasure and this reward for having been Hamas supporters. In a sense, we carried on.
So we went on 3 weeks just to not to
5 weeks
please these people?
To force Hamas to come on their knees to Egypt, not to do the bidding of Qatar and Turkey, but which was, unfortunately, supported for a while by the, if I may be blunt, witless interventions of the American Secretary of State at the time, which won him some very aggressive reactions from some Israeli politicians, much of which he actually deserved. For us, this cooperation with Egypt in containing and basically reshaping the way Hamas looks at the world is an important project. And the Egyptians are in on it. And even